What would a British person call the biscuits that Americans put gravy on? What are the biscuits that Americans put gravy on called in British English? They are very different from British biscuits. I like both kinds of biscuits, but the British ones would not be good with gravy.
A couple of reference works that explore terminological differences between US English and British English argue for scone as the approximate British English equivalent of the US English biscuit. From Norman Scher, British English A to Z, 3rd edition, 2007. Scone, n, approximate baking powder biscuit, should rhyme with John, though the long O is also heard in some circles, usually served at room temperature, while the approximate American equivalent is served warm. The usual fare for tea. And from Christopher Davies, Divided by a Common Language, A Guide to British and American English, 2005. Grocery Nemesis. Uck biscuit, scone. If you search Google Images for pictures of English scone, you'll find many instances of a circular baked good that looks very much like a US biscuit. In US bakeries, however, items sold under the name scone tend to be significantly larger than a regular unsweetened southern US biscuit and wedge-shaped and, often, sparsely sprinkled on top with granulated sugar. In the US, as, according to Scher, in the UK, scones are generally sold or served at room temperature, and in my experience they still taste pretty good 24 hours after production. US biscuits, in contrast, are heavenly when eaten minutes after leaving the oven but rapidly lose their perfection as they age. Being from the edge of the US South rather than from its interior, I wouldn't drown a fresh biscuit in white pen gravy, that's what grits are for. But a very warm biscuit split and then reclosed clam style over a thin slice of sweet butter is, like properly made fresh cornbread, one of the simple joys of life.
The word is ambiguous, but the object it describes in North America does not exist in British cuisine, so one cannot translate it by a single word. Some things are like that. To communicate the information. In concise text for an educated audience I would write American biscuits. In speech I would say what Americans call biscuits. In a cookery book, I would explain what they are and provide a picture.
Strictly speaking, the answer is that there is no word in British English for this. Other answers that say scone, roll, dumpling, etc. are describing what the closest similar thing in the UK is, but that was not the question. The average person in the UK would not know what biscuits and gravy are. They don't exist there. If you presented them with a plateful and asked what the name is, they could only guess. They might say the biscuits look similar to some other thing, probably a scone, but that they are not exactly that thing, though there are a wide variety of scones. If you told them they are biscuits, they would find that odd, because to them, biscuits are what Americans call cookies, so they are clearly not what they know as biscuits. But they would still not have some other word to use. If asked again in the future to identify them, they might say American biscuits, but that is not a commonly known borrowing, so they would likely need to give an explanation to someone else, like a kind of bread, something like an unsweetened scone, that Americans call biscuits, and put a kind of strange white gravy on. Isn't that weird?
I did wonder what Americans called a biscuit and put gravy on because we don't really have an equivalent item. If they are like a sort of savory scone, then the nearest thing is cobbler, which is essentially scones placed on top of a casserole or pie filling as an alternative to pastry for a pie, or mashed potato for a cottage or shepherd's pie, but it is also used with fruit fillings. However, we don't use cobbler a lot. and don't serve it separately with gravy. The nearest thing historically, and possibly where the us term comes from, is ship's biscuit or hardtack, which was the staple food of sailors on windjammers. The word biscuit comes from a French word meaning twice baked, and although our sweet biscuits are not usually baked twice, they are more similar to a twice-baked confection than us biscuits, and are a close equivalent to a cookie. By the way, Norman Schur, quoted by Sven Yargs in his answer, was mistaken in stating that the word scone is normally pronounced with a short O, and that the long O is only used in some circles. The use of long and short O's is pretty evenly spread through all strata of society and is the source of endless, pointless, online discussion. I grew up using the long O pronunciation and thinking that the short O version was posh, but I've come across lots of people who grew up with the short O pronunciation and thought that the long O version was posh. I've also never heard or read of an RP speaker criticizing the long O pronunciation, so can't believe that it's considered common.
As a Brit, we wouldn't be familiar with this kind of biscuit. The closest I'd related to is some kind of bread roll. Other forms of American biscuit look more like what we'd term as scones. Despite the description of scone in the Wikipedia entry, we do experience savory scones in the form of cheese scones, ones baked with grated cheese in the mixture, served warm with a butter spread. As Brits, we don't typically serve gravy on any kind of bread, so this whole experience would be seen as new, or in many cases, weird. There isn't really a set answer to the question in hand because there's no direct equivalent in everyday British use of bread and gravy-based meals.